Hello, 大家好. Good day, everybody. I'm back from my trip to the evil empire of President Xi. I survived a 5-star hotel, a luxury room, and an upset stomach. Otherwise, it was a great visit to Beijing, although the temperatures outside were bloody cold. Freezing, actually. The welcome, though, was extraordinarily warm. That warmth and friendliness, a real contrast to many of the other places I visit, has prompted this video. By the way, this is the first of a new video style on this channel, now named Quartermaine. I'll still include books and writing as a core element, but we've broadened the approach to be more polemical. It was a little naive to think that opining about books could ignore politics and opinion about the world's ways. After all, surely that's what many books are about. Back to China. The country gets an almost universally bad press, mainly driven by politics in the USA. Some may recall the Yellow Peril. In the 19th century, Asians, especially Chinese, were racially stereotyped as a threat. The stereotyping used inflammatory language, often sexual, and images like these. This blatant racism continued up to about 1942, up to Pearl Harbor, in fact, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, when the Americans needed the help of the Chinese to help fight the Japanese. What seems shocking today is that the elements of this antiquated anti-Chinese sentiment, equally racist now as before, have emerged as political currency. China is routinely blamed for many of the world's ills. I won't list them all, but they include theft of intellectual property and the corruption of the West's youth by TikTok. Sean Strickland, who is the new UFC fighting champion, said this just yesterday, quote, "I'm not chasing the Chinese checkmark of Nike," end quote. Look, anecdotes are pretty worthless evidence, but I'll tell my story anyway. I worked in China, south, in Hainan Island in the late 1990s. Then we built a snack food factory in Fujian around 2004. And I was last there about 5 years ago, researching alternative plant-based medicines. These experiences had their moments, but were generally fun. I always found it easy to make friends, and in my off time, I learned Tai Chi from a national champion at Hainan Haiku University. So I worried about what it would be like for this visit. Leaving aside a 24-hour stomach bug, it was delightful. The hotel staff's friendliness and eagerness to help was the best feature. My local colleagues were super, and the other folk I met were open and quite transparent in what they had to say. Getting a visa here in Bangkok, arrival, meetings, etc., was as smooth and pleasant as anywhere I've ever been. So it seems worth looking at China more objectively than the political rhetoric heard in the West. What do we mean by China? And that seems like a daft question. Yes, it's a nation state, but then so are the Maldive Islands. The population of New Zealand or Singapore would barely represent a couple of counties in China. Shanghai has 26 million people, which is larger population than Australia. China is 20% of the human race, while the USA is just 5%. Add in Europe even, about 750 million people, and you still haven't reached anywhere near what China's human resources are. And these resources are not just funny people in pointed straw hats planting rice. China's middle income group, individuals with incomes over, let's say, $3,000, surpassed 400 million people in 2017. $3,000 may not sound very much in America, but it buys you a lot more in China than in the USA. The Boston Consulting Group, BCG, says China will add 80 million people to the middle and upper classes by 2030. One other thing to say about demographics. Most Chinese, over 90%, are ethnically Han people. These people originally settled in the central plain of China, and we'll get to that. And the name Han comes from the dynasty that ruled from around 202 BC. However, there are 55 other ethnic minority groups, over 100 million people. The number of dialects and the different accents in which the lingua franca, Mandarin, is spoken is enormous. So what is China like geographically? You can't generalize. It covers a huge swathe of the Earth's surface. I discovered that the north gets freezing cold. The south gets steaming hot. West, there are impassable deserts. The Uyghurs live in Xinjiang. The South China Sea is always in the news, named the East Sea by the Vietnamese. In an important respect, China looks like this. What the map shows is that only small parts of China, about 12% of the total, produce food. And that depends on intensive irrigation systems, some of which have been in place for thousands of years. There's no room for mistakes in China. Much of the Communist Party of China, the CCP, like its predecessors, is driven by concern over food supply. Political struggles have always been over who controlled the northern central plain between the two main rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze. About a third of the population lives in this region. So let's turn to history. An excellent place to start is around 221 BC, when Qin Shi Huangdi established the relatively short-lived Qin dynasty. The Qin were a poverty-stricken pastoral people who lived in the upland margins in the northwest. But they were aggressive, and during a long period of conflict that lasted about 500 years, they eventually conquered and unified the other 6 independent states. They did so under the influence of a legal scholar named Shan Yang. He used harsh, but what he thought were fair means of control. His laws applied to everybody, not just the peasants. And in the end, ironically, Shan Yang broke one of his own laws and was executed. I wonder where I've heard complaints about one law for them and another for the rest of us. Not in China, at least, not then. I'd suggest that this ancient approach underlies much of the acceptance of the methods, what we call undemocratic and repressive, which have been used by every dynasty since the Qin. Every Chinese ruler since the Qin has seen the need to keep the people nailed down. By the way, the CCP is a dynasty, just with a modern name. President Xi is an emperor who, as the old traditions have it, has the mandate of heaven. He holds legitimate power, derived not least from his ability to deliver a growing economy, food, and safety. History seldom evolves peacefully, and China, since the Qin, for well over 2,000 years, has had one civil war after another. And take a look at this, the impact of these wars and conflicts on the population. The worst catastrophe faced by the West was the Black Death. Compared to the destruction of the Chinese population on an almost predictable basis, the Black Death was nothing much to mention. Is it any wonder that the CCP has three main priorities: ensuring the food supply, making sure that the civil society is stable, regrettably at the cost of freedom and democracy, defending its hegemony of critical areas, for example, Tibet, where it has water resources, Xinjiang, where they think of as a potential food basket, and Taiwan as a bulwark in the Eastern Sea. I haven't scratched the surface. The subject is obviously enormous, but I'd suggest some research before ill-educated journalists and ignorant politicians jump to conclusions about why the Chinese government behaves as it does. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, but every Chinese knows their history, and most know that their country is vulnerable in critical areas. If you want to learn more, an excellent place to start is the records of the Grand Historian, Sima Qian, the first of China's 24 dynastic histories. Then look at Science and Civilization in China, an ongoing series of books published by Cambridge University Press. A final thought. The Grand Historian, Sima Qian, spoke out of turn. These days, he'd have been cancelled or ignored. Not back then. Given the choice of being castrated or executed, he chose the former to finish writing his history. Ouch! Understand that the Chinese do not inhabit the same historical, political, and psychological framework as the rest of us. And since they comprise the single most significant subset of humanity, that's probably worth remembering. I hope you enjoyed this new episode of Quartermaine. Hope to see you next time. 新年快乐! Happy Chinese New Year, everybody.